Gene Tierney was once called the unluckiest lucky girl in the world, and today I am going to tell you why. For a period of time, Gene was known as the former starlet who underwent several lobotomies, but that didn't actually happen. That's right, there's no evidence that that ever happened. However, the real story of Gene Tierney is even more shocking and heartbreaking. I'm Ashley, and welcome to Beauty Biography, where every episode we deep dive into the life of a beauty icon while creating a very loosely inspired makeup look. Today is all about one of Hollywood's most misrepresented starlets, Gene Tierney. Let us begin. Gene Eliza Tierney was born in Brooklyn, New York on November 19th, 1920. Gene's parents were Belle and Howard, and they called Gene Princess, which, I mean, who doesn't call their firstborn daughter Princess? I think we all do. Gene is the firstborn daughter, but not the first child. She has an older brother named Butch, and she'll go on to have a younger sister named Pat. Gene's father, Howard Tierney, was a very successful insurance broker. He had his own insurance company and he made a lot of money from that. He was also very strict. His youngest daughter, Gene's younger sister, Pat, described him as being too strict. He was a very firm, disciplinarian, and whatever he said went. His answer was the final answer. When Gene is 6 years old, her father moves the family to Connecticut, where they lived in this beautiful, large, sprawling house, and they had everything that they could ask for. However, Gene's childhood was not perfect. Howard and Belle fought a lot, and this was incredibly stressful for Gene. She would have nightmares because of this, and she became quite anxious because of the fighting. I think it's important to understand that when children grow up with parents who fight often or fight loudly or just do not resolve conflicts in a healthy manner, that leads children to feel incredibly unsafe. Children rely on their parents for stability, and so while Gene did have financial stability, housing stability, all of those things, there still was not peace in the home, and that creates its own kind of instability. Children don't have the frame of reference to tell the difference between these different types of instability, so that kind of chaos is very damaging to them because they just know that something feels unsafe. And we're going to see the consequences of this later on in Gene's life. Gene attended private schools and she got a great education. She would kind of throw herself into creative outlets to kind of escape some of the fighting at home and how that made her feel. So she would often write poetry, and her first poem, titled Night, was published in her school magazine. She also played the role of Jo in a school production of Little Women, which is my favorite role in Little Women, so good for her. These really did help her kind of escape that inner turmoil that she felt was there in her home life. Now, Gene's father, like we said, he was super strict, and it's not that he was unsupportive of Gene's talent. I think he just kind of was probably one of those people that says oh, I'm not a pessimist, I'm a realist, or I'm just pragmatic. He was that kind of type. So he wasn't unsupportive, but really he wanted Gene ultimately to get married to a man from a nice family, a man that could provide for her and become a mother. That was really the extent of his aspirations for her. That's not unheard of because this is the 1930s, but still it's kind of sad to think of, a father thinking of success for his daughter only in terms of marriage and motherhood. I'm really glad times have changed as the mother of a daughter and as someone's daughter who didn't do that to me. Thanks, Dad. Even though Howard was pretty strict, he did really care about Gene. So when Gene's 15 years old, she wants to do a study abroad program, and surprisingly, Howard says yes. So Gene goes to Lausanne, Switzerland to study for 2 years, and while she's there, she learns French. Now, when Gene gets back from Switzerland, she's really surprised because her father has lost the childhood home that she grew up in. There had been a lawsuit against his business, and because of this, he wasn't able to hold on to their home. They still are living, you know, a pretty nice lifestyle. It's not like he's completely broke. It's just not as lavish as Gene was used to growing up. Her dad really did want to like try to keep up appearances though, and, you know, continue to give his kids some great experiences. So in 1938, he sends the entire family on a road trip to the West Coast. Gene has a really fun time, but she's most interested in the tour that they do in Los Angeles of Warner Brothers. Now, while she's touring the lots of Warner Brothers, she's discovered by a director named Anatole Litvak. He wants Gene to tape a screen test, and the very shocked 17-year-old Gene says yes. Now, Gene had no formal training, but the studio loved her screen test so much that they offer her a contract for about $150 a week. And in today's money, that would be around $3,200 a week or $166,000 a year. Gene was thrilled, okay? She really wanted to accept this offer, but Howard, her very strict father, and I'm going to keep saying Howard, her father, because we're going to see here in a little bit, there are a lot of Howards in Gene's life, which is kind of confusing. So Howard says no, which at first I was thinking like, well, why would you say no if you guys are struggling financially? But the thing is, like, at this point in time, I mean, Hollywood is still exploitative now, but it was definitely exploitative then, like even more exploitative. To Howard, he doesn't feel like $166,000 is a large amount of money. They're not doing as well as they had been, but he still understands wealth, and to him that's just not enough money for what they would be asking of Gene, which is moving to LA away from her family and, you know, being basically owned by the studio system. Gene's disappointed, but she decides that she's gonna try to kind of like negotiate with her father, and it works. So she makes a deal with her dad. She agrees that she'll go home and make her official society debut, and then afterwards her father will allow her to audition in New York for Broadway, which he sees as more legitimate. So after her debutante ball, Gene starts auditioning, and within 1 month, she wins a small part in the Broadway play, Mrs. O'Brien Entertains. The play Mrs. O'Brien Entertains is a critical flop, but Gene gets rave reviews for her small part. All the theater critics start whining and dining her because they see her as like the one to watch. Her next role is a larger one. It's in the play The Male Animal, and with that play, she becomes a Broadway sensation. One night, Daryl F. Zanuck is in the audience of the play, and oh boy, we have definitely talked about Daryl F. Zanuck before, but just in case this is your first time watching Beauty Biography or you haven't seen one of the episodes where he just lovingly graces us with his presence, Daryl F. Zanuck was like one of the architects of old Hollywood's studio system. So it was him and Harry Cohn. Oh, Harry Cohn. Those two, Daryl and Harry, are basically like the original Harvey Weinsteins, okay? They paved the way for old nasty Harvey. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see an episode where we just roast those schmucks. And fun fact, Daryl Zanuck, later in life, he gets his, which I just... chef's kiss. We love karma. Anyway, Daryl is in the audience one night at the Male Animal, and he immediately wants to sign Gene. He just thinks she is fantastic. Gene is really excited about this, but she's also pretty happy on Broadway. So she's willing to like hold out for a better offer. Ultimately, with her father's help, she secures a contract for $750 a week, which today would be about $16,000, coming up to a total of $832,000 a year in 2023. So her dad was kind of right. Like, you know, she definitely deserved more, and she was able to get it by waiting literally about 18 months. Gene's father, Howard, he sets up this company to control and kind of hold all of Gene's money from acting and to promote her career. So obviously he is as strict and controlling as ever. When Gene arrives in Hollywood in 1939, one of the first people she meets is Howard Hughes, and he tries to seduce her, as he pretty much did everyone back then. He tries to seduce her by flaunting his wealth, but Gene has grown up wealthy, so she's not impressed at all, but the two do become friends. months. Now, Gene's first major motion picture is The Return of Frank James, starring Henry Fonda. When the film is released in 1940, Gene watches it and she hates how she sounds and she doesn't like how she looks. And she's only made more upset when the Harvard Lampoon names her the worst female discovery of the year, which was very rude. So Gene does two things that one does when they don't like their voice or how they look. The first one is she writes to Harper's Bazaar and she asks them for a diet plan. And they publish one and she ends up following it for 25 years, which is very sad. Diet culture has definitely been around for so much longer than I think we realize. And then the second thing Gene does is she starts smoking to lower the pitch and tone of her voice. Now, despite Gene's disappointment in how she looked and how she sounded, the movie The Return of Frank James is a big success and Gene starts booking roles regularly. Gene was very serious about becoming the best actress that she could be, and because her father had always been so strict, Gene was very used to being like super obedient and going above and beyond in everything that was asked of her. This really helps her kind of succeed early on. Now, in Hollywood at this time, there wasn't much diversity, so oddly enough, Gene is actually seen as being somewhat exotic, which, okay, if you say so. The studio capitalized on that in several films, including the 1941 film Tobacco Road, where Gene plays a seductive hillbilly. So that same year, Gene also appears in the Western outlaw film Belle Starr, and she appears as an outlaw. In December of 1940, Gene had met a man named Count Oleg Cassini, and if that name sounds familiar, it's probably because you have seen it on wedding dresses at David's Bridal. Yes, it is the same Oleg Cassini. You can go Google it now, and you can find the wedding dress collection that bears his name now on the David's Bridal website, and I did do that, and I browsed for a bit. I wasn't that disappointed. There's some good stuff. So at the time, Oleg is a European designer for Paramount Pictures. He's 26 years old, he's divorced, and he is aristocratic, and Gene is in love. By their second date, Oleg and Gene are discussing marriage, and this probably won't shock you, but Howard Tierney, he was not down with this, okay? He was so not down with this that he threatened that if the two tried to get married, he would have Gene declared mentally unstable in order to prevent the marriage. Gene is 20 years old by now, and she feels really conflicted by this because, you know what? She's not a little girl anymore, but her controlling father is still very much in charge of her life. He's in charge of her finances still, even though she's the one acting and making the money, and now he's trying to retain control over her personal life. To make matters worse, it's not just Gene's father who is against this relationship between Gene and Oleg. The studio is also very against it. They want to control Gene's image, and they don't think Oleg will be a good fit for her image with the public. So the studio decides to bolster Gene's image. They want to set her up on these fake staged dates that the press will then photograph. Now nowadays, when we think of PR curation, we don't think that it's as prevalent as it used to be. In our minds, we think of Kris Jenner kind of staging relationships and being a puppet master and all of those paparazzi photo ops. But honestly, Kris Jenner had nothing on the old Hollywood studio system. They were masters of manipulating reality in order to make their stars more popular with the American public. These arranged dates that the studio sends Gene on lead to Gene and Oleg splitting up, and this sends Gene into depression. And we're talking actual, doesn't want to eat, doesn't want to sleep, can't get out of bed, having a lot of problems, depression, not just oh, she was sad. She really is depressed. So in April of 1941, she travels home to Connecticut, hoping that maybe being at home and around her family is going to help her out of this depression. But unfortunately, just when Gene thinks things can't get any worse, they get much, much worse. While Gene is home in Connecticut, she discovers that her father, Howard, is having an affair with one of her mother's friends. Gene has been obedient. She has done everything her father has asked her to do for almost 21 years. So finding out that her father is being unfaithful to her mother and is not the person she thought he was is unbearable for Gene. So she goes back to LA and she begs Oleg to reunite because she is done submitting every decision to the will of her father. And good for Gene. Oleg takes Gene up on this offer, and on June 1st, 1941, the couple secretly eloped to Las Vegas. Everyone is very pissed. The studio fires Oleg, and Howard Tierney, Gene's father, publicly tells the press that he is going to try to have the marriage annulled because his daughter is clearly not in her right mind. I think we would call this a little bit of an overreaction, but good on Gene. She does not back down. She has found her independence and she decides, you know what, I'm going to dissolve the corporation. So she decides to dissolve that corporation that her father had set up to hold and control her earnings. But she is shocked when, in doing so, she realizes that all of her savings are gone. Her father has taken all of that money and put it into saving his own failing insurance business. It is yet another betrayal from her father, and it sends Gene even further reeling. She is in agony over this, and once again, it only gets worse for Gene. Her parents end up divorcing. Gene vows to never speak to her father again. Her entire world has collapsed. She had grown up in this family unit, and for all of its flaws, it was all she knew. And it was such a strong and rigid structure that now that it is gone and she sees all these like holes and lies and gaps, she just feels like she doesn't know what or who to trust. Her foundation is basically crumbling underneath her. So Gene throws herself into acting. In the late summer of 1941, she appears in the Shanghai Gesture, and the studio hires her husband Oleg to design her wardrobe. So that's a step ahead. You can imagine that after all the turmoil of just like a month or two before this, it's really a welcome development. In 1942, Gene appears in Son of Fury, Ring on Her Fingers, Thunderbirds, and China Girl, all in 1 year. So she really kept busy. Now, while Gene is filming Rings on Her Fingers, Pearl Harbor is attacked, and this sends the United States into World War II. As many Hollywood people did, Oleg decides to join the military, and Gene begins going across the country to promote the sale of war bonds. I know we've discussed war bonds being sold by other Hollywood stars, but I don't think we've really ever talked about exactly what those were. So for those who may not know, war bonds were a way the US Treasury raised funds for the war. Makes sense, right? Right. It's basically like a loan from private citizens to the US government. So for example, you could buy a $25 war bond for $18.75. So you spent $18.75, and then when that war bond matured in 10 years, you could then cash it in and get $25. So that $6.25 difference was like interest paid to you by the government. Now, war bonds served multiple purposes. So not only was the government getting money to fund the war without having to raise taxes too much, it also helped fight against inflation that often happens during wartime, because when money comes out of circulation, that helps slow down inflation. If the US Fed wants to call me, I can help you with economics. Just kidding, I can't. So Gene supports the war efforts by promoting war bonds, and her star continues to grow in Hollywood. In 1943, her film Heaven Can Wait is released. It was the first time that Gene had played a mother, and this was pretty fitting because while Gene is filming this movie, she finds out that she is pregnant. Gene is over the moon. She feels like all this chaos is behind her, and she is finally gonna have stability and a joyful family life that she knew before everything fell apart. But as is often the case in Gene's life, just when she thinks things are going well, the rug gets pulled out from under her. So 1 week before Gene's maternity leave is set to start, she decides to go appear at the Hollywood canteen to greet soldiers. This is something that Hollywood stars at the time would often do. It was meant to raise morale. It was definitely a good deed on Gene's part. Now, a few days after this visit to the Hollywood canteen, Gene is shocked when she wakes up not feeling well, and she looks in the mirror and she has red bumps all over her face. She has contracted German measles from her visit to greet the troops. Now, Jean's doctors tell her there's nothing to worry about, but if you've ever been pregnant, you know when you get sick and you're pregnant, it is stressful. Jean's doctors say, though, it's gonna be fine. Don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. So Jean goes on, as she had planned already, to take her maternity leave and go live with Oleg at a military base. So she's there with Oleg on base for a few months, and they live like this very normal American life. She's basically just like a military wife. Now, Oleg said that this was basically the happiest that he ever saw Jean. They truly were happy and at peace, but unfortunately, rather than being a lasting peace, this is going to be the calm before a storm. And pretty soon, this storm is going to guarantee that Jean's life will never be the same again. So on October 15th, 1943, Jean gave birth prematurely to her and Oleg's daughter, Daria. Now at birth, Daria only weighs a little over 3 pounds, which is a big deal now. So please imagine how stressful that would have been in 1943. However, Jean, she's just ecstatic. She's in love with her new baby girl, as would be expected. Because of this, her and Oleg are both devastated when they learn that Daria has been born partially blind. Now, while talking about this, we have to be cognizant that when we're talking about the stars of the past, we're talking about very different times. And these times lacked not only some understanding that we now have, but they also lacked many of the medical and accessibility advancements that we have today. So Jean is devastated by this, and again, things go from bad to worse when Jean finds out that not only is Daria partially blind, she's also deaf and she has a severe intellectual disability. All of this is because of those German measles that she had caught early in her pregnancy. Now, this is truly a mother's worst nightmare, and please know that I mean that not in any way as if there was something wrong with Daria or any child that's born with any of those challenges. But I mean that because when you are pregnant, you just pray and hope that your child will be happy and healthy and have as few challenges in life as possible, because you don't want anything to prevent them from happiness and fulfillment. It's not because you'll love them any less if there's something standing in their way. It's because you love them so much that all you want is for them to have the happiest, most fulfilled life, the most comfortable life. So for this, I completely understand why Jean was inconsolable at times. Oleg would say that he would tell Jean, there's no hope for our daughter, which, not gonna lie, not a huge fan of Oleg's on that one. It would send Jean into just hysterical screaming and crying. She couldn't bear the idea that her child was going to be in pain or going to have any kind of unhappiness in her life. And honestly, I would have screamed and cried too. Oleg even admits that at one point he just leaves the hospital and starts running because he says he realized that Jean was never going to be the same again. Of course she isn't. So Jean returns to Los Angeles with Daria, and by chance, she's at some tennis courts one day and she meets a fan of hers. The fan is a woman and a former Marine, and she tells Jean, "Oh, we've actually met before." And Jean says, "Oh, have we?" And the fan says, "Yes, at the Hollywood canteen." And you guys, this is insane. The fan admits to Jean that she was such a big fan that she had left her unit to go see Jean at the Hollywood canteen against orders. This woman said, "Oh, I just adore you so much. I couldn't miss the chance to meet you." And then the woman tells Jean why she was not supposed to leave the base. She was supposed to be in quarantine for German measles. Time is a flat circle, because if that's not 2020 in a nutshell, I don't know what is. Now, I don't know how Jean didn't punch this woman square in the jaw, because heaven help me, I am a pretty zen person, but I am not above my raising, and I would have had to throw a swing. Because, as we all know, by this point, Jean also knows that Daria is facing all these challenges because Jean had contracted German measles while pregnant. And here she is, face to face with the woman who gave her German measles. Now, rather than deck her, Gene quickly and quietly just turns and walks away. She was horrified. She has this intense inner conflict and guilt because she's literally staring down the idea that her fame and success brought this pain upon her beloved firstborn child. It's a terrible weight that she has to carry for the rest of her life. Gene throws herself back into work, and a year after Daria's birth, she stars in the romantic mystery film Laura. It is an incredible film, and Gene is the perfect fit for the title role of Laura. She is hauntingly beautiful, and her performance gets rave reviews from critics and audiences alike. At age 24, this film makes Gene the most in-demand actress in Hollywood. But as we have seen, this has come at a great cost. Gene has endured this tragedy with her daughter, and on top of that, her family has disowned her because of her marriage to Oleg, and now Oleg, he's not the catch at all that she thought he was. So when World War II is over, he comes back to LA and he, gets his honorable discharge from the military, and his eyes begin to wander, and then other body parts of his start to wander. This starts to break down the marriage between Oleg and Gene. Oleg will later admit that he did cheat on Gene, although he basically blamed Gene. He said that he had lived so long as the husband of Gene Tierney, and he was simply reacting to that emasculation, which, tell me you have a fragile ego without telling me you have a fragile ego. Gene's life is falling apart behind the scenes, but as it does, it seems like her star is just rising even more on the big screen. In 1945, she stars in the year's most coveted role as a wife driven to murder by jealousy in the film Leave Her to Heaven. Gene felt this film was her best work, and she was incredibly proud when the film broke box office records and earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. The award would end up going to Joan Crawford for Mildred Pierce, but it was truly an honor to Gene to just be nominated. She finally felt validated for more than just being beautiful. So of course, because Gene has found, some sort of peace, we know that there's bound to be more heartache on the horizon. In 1946, Gene is incredibly successful in her career, but she is tormented personally. She knows her husband is cheating on her, and this leads to public arguments between her and Oleg. These get so bad that they end up being written about in gossip columns. Oleg, for his part, can't be good in any way apparently, because not only is he cheating on Gene, but he's also not as supportive of Daria as Gene wanted. Often there can be a strain on relationships when a child has a health condition, and that happens here. But that's still not any excuse for Oleg just really sucking it up. Howard Hughes, Gene's old friend, he was very helpful to Gene during this time. He paid for the best specialists when it came to Daria. He wanted to make sure she got the best care. And when those specialists tell Gene that Daria will indeed need professional care for the rest of her life, Howard Hughes pays to place Daria in some of the best facilities. Now, this is incredibly helpful to Gene, and she's very appreciative to Howard, but having to let Daria go live elsewhere breaks Gene in even more ways than she already felt broken. Howard Hughes, he's disgusted by Oleg, and for once, I'm on Howard Hughes' side, and honestly, if Howard Hughes, I have said this before, if Howard Hughes thinks that you are a creepy a-hole, you are really a creepy a-hole. So Howard Hughes is telling Gene, leave Oleg, marry me, I will take care of you. And one does have to wonder how many women Howard Hughes proposed to, because I feel like this happens a lot in Beauty Biography. Anyway, Oleg, being the gentleman he is, he feels like he can cheat on Gene, but how dare she accept any help from Howard Hughes for their daughter? And one day he literally hits and chases Howard with a 2x4. He's a real classy gentleman. But it turns out Oleg maybe shouldn't have been so worried about Howard, because Gene turns Howard down, but one day she's on set filming when she looks up and she meets the gaze of a handsome young Navy lieutenant and future president. That's right, y'all. It's JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy himself. JFK is charming and sweet and all those things that we think of him to be, and an affair soon begins between him and Gene. After JFK wins his first congressional race in 1946, Gene tells Oleg it's over. She wants a divorce. She is going to be the wife of a Kennedy. And now this might be the only time where Oleg actually gives Gene the exact hard truth that she needs to hear, because when Gene tells him, hey, I want a divorce to marry JFK, Oleg straight up tells her, don't waste your time with a Catholic who has political ambitions. He's not wrong. JFK has high political ambitions and he was Catholic. So the idea that he would marry a divorcee with a child, incredibly unlikely, like snowballs chance in hell, honestly. But Gene really did believe JFK would marry her. So she goes to visit him in Cape Cod for a week. And one day over lunch, he tells her straight up, Gene, I love you, but I can never marry you. Gene is heartbroken, but yet again, it comes at a time where her career is thriving. Right around the time that JFK tells her they can never wed, her film The Ghost and Mrs Muir is released in theaters. Now, if you have never seen this film, do yourself a favor and rent it on Amazon Prime. It is absolutely delightful and heartwarming. It has a 100% fresh score on Rotten Tomatoes, and there's a reason why, okay? It is old Hollywood magic at its finest. And you might recall, this is the film where Gene's daughter is played by another one of our Beauty Biography icons, last episode's Natalie Wood. This performance in this movie is considered one of Gene's most tender. I won't give any spoilers, but I think if you watch it, you'll see the parallels between the film and Gene's life at this time. In 1948, Gene is back with Oleg, and I don't know why, but she is, and I guess it's a good thing, because on her 28th birthday, Gene gives birth to their second daughter, Christina. Christina was healthy, and this was a huge relief to Gene, so she pours her heart and soul into Christina. And I want to be very clear, I don't think Gene loved Christina any more than she loved Daria, because I'm a mom, so I know she didn't. But at the time, Gene was unable to have Daria in her home and to be with her daily. So I think having Christina there with her and being able to be more of that traditional mother helped to kind of heal some wounds that Gene had. Gene has always been a hard worker, and in the 2 years after Christina's birth, she stars in 5 films. Me, I've made 8 YouTube videos since my son was born, and I thought that was hard work. So good for Gene. Gene was described as being very gracious to everyone. She was always taking care of everyone around her, from her family and friends to even the crew on set. She never wanted to inconvenience anyone, and she would literally go out of her way to make things easier on crew members. So we can see that like intense obedience that her father instilled in her also kind of gave her this like sense of wanting to take care of other people and being thoughtful and mindful of other people, which is an incredible thing. Gene was certainly never thought of as a diva or as difficult, although I'm okay with people being difficult. She definitely was seen more of like a gentle, gracious kind of presence, and many people kind of described her as like the original Grace Kelly. By 1951, Gene and Oleg's marriage has come to its breaking point. Gene was filming Way of a Gaucho in Argentina, and she tells Oleg, if you don't come to see me while I'm filming down here, I will divorce you. Now, Oleg decides that he doesn't like ultimatums. Okay, nobody does, but whatever. So he decides, you know what? I'm not gonna go see you, Gene. And once again, it's just kind of like a theme in Gene's life. Things go from bad to worse. While Gene is filming this movie in Argentina, she starts writing these letters to Oleg where she like rambles, at times allegedly, that her co-workers are conspiring against her, that they're all out to get her. So she's getting like super paranoid and kind of having alternating manic and depressive episodes. Nowadays, we know like that might be bipolar disorder. But back then in 1951, things just weren't that advanced yet. They were working on it, but they weren't quite there. So Gene is mentally struggling, and when she gets home to LA after she wraps filming on The Way of a Gaucho, she decides it's finally time, and she finally goes forward with the divorce from Oleg. Unfortunately, cutting ties with Oleg is not going to solve the problems that are brewing within Gene's mind. Gene begins to realize that her behavior is getting more erratic, and it scares her. It started with those letters to Oleg, but it's getting worse. It's getting to be like she's forgetting lines. She can't memorize them, and she just feels mentally scattered. She tells one friend that she feels like she's fallen down a manhole and there's nowhere for her to grab to hold on to. Like, her grasp of reality feels very fragile. This is only made worse by a romance that she strikes up with Prince Ali Khan. Now, you guys might remember him. He was one of Rita Hayworth's husband. So this romance between Gene and Ali Khan is like a whirlwind. And Prince Ali's father is very, 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 very against the relationship. Ali proposes to Gene, but this time Gene is the one on the receiving end of the ultimatum. So Ali says, like, in order for them to get married, Gene has to come to his country, become a Muslim, and cut off her family. This is too much for Gene, and she ultimately declines. By the time that Gene appears in The Left Hand of God with Humphrey Bogart, she is on the verge of a breakdown. She's heartbroken and she is suffering. Between takes, she would just disappear, and Bogey would have to feed her lines while they were filming because she could not remember them. Finally, at the age of 34, Gene collapses and she ends up going to live with her mother. While living with her mother in New York, she often locks herself in the bedroom and hallucinates. Eventually, Gene sees the problem is really bad, and so she agrees to be committed to a psychiatric hospital. That psychiatric hospital where she's at in New York, they deem her case too serious to treat there, and so they transfer her to a second hospital where she undergoes electric shock therapy. Which, trust me, electric shock therapy in 1954 is just as bad as you would imagine. The descriptions of what she went through are terrifying. I will not repeat them. Now, it's around this time that some people claim that Gene underwent a lobotomy, but there's absolutely no evidence that ever happened. And trust me, the 20 electric shock treatments that she undergoes are bad enough. They're bad enough that they damage some of her memories. After Gene is released from the hospital, after these 20 electric shock therapies, she goes back to New York to stay with her mother again, but she is committed to a third hospital after she almost jumps off of her mother's apartment building. Thankfully, this new hospital is located in Kansas, and it's very different from the last two that Gene had been at. So this hospital, the doctors, they prescribe her new medications that help her mental state, and she begins therapy to deal with these underlying traumas and tragedies. She finally sees light at the end of the tunnel, and it's because she is finally treated with some respect at this hospital, which every single person deserves, no matter what they are going through. In 1958, Gene is released from the hospital and she goes on vacation to Colorado, where she meets a Texas oil baron named Howard Lee. So here we have the third Howard in Gene's life. Now, after only a few short months together, the two begin discussing marriage. Things are looking up, so of course, like a bad play, here we go again. Poor Gene, she returns to a normal life, so to speak, but she is overwhelmed by all the press attention on her, and she suffers another mental crisis. She has to go back to the hospital in Kansas. Now, after a few months of treatment in Kansas, her doctors encourage her to start working part-time. She can't be far from the hospital because she's still undergoing treatment, so she finds a job close by and she begins working as a sales clerk in a dress shop in Kansas. Now, this really helps Gene, and that makes sense. Of all the life lessons that I've learned, one of the ones that has always kind of stuck with me is that you need to have a purpose. My dad literally drilled this into me. He would always tell me, you know what, Ashley, when you lay down at the end of the day, you need to have something to show for that day. I have found this to be true. So for a long time, Gene's purpose was working on her growth and on her healing, which can absolutely be a full-time purpose. But once Gene started doing better, it makes sense that having some purpose outside of her healing journey would be beneficial for her. While she's working at the store, which was called Talmadge's, the press, of course, catches wind. They come to interview her, and she's actually incredibly open about her struggles and why she is where she is and why she's doing what she's doing. This is a very valiant act on her part because those things were just not talked about back then. We have seen so many women in Beauty Biography that have really paved the way for us to speak openly about mental health today. It has been a long and slow road, but women like Gene really took their own struggles and laid them down to make that path for others to talk about these things more openly. A few days before her 39th birthday, Gene was released from the hospital, and guess what? Howard Lee, he is still with her. To his credit, he has supported her in a way that the men before him had not supported Gene. Gene feels like with Howard by her side and all this healing done, she is ready to return to work in Hollywood. But the next year is still going to be a tumultuous one for her. In 1960, Gene's former paramour, Prince Ali Khan, is killed in a car accident in May. Then she marries Howard Lee in July, and in November, JFK is elected president. Now, it can be kind of hard to see your ex elected president, I would imagine. But are you ready for the part where it goes from insult to injury? Let's rip off the band-aid, because the month after her former lover JFK is elected, to top off a crazy year, it is announced that Gene's ex-husband Oleg will be designing Jacqueline Kennedy's wardrobe. Earlier in Oleg's career, Gene had literally bankrolled his fashion company so that he could design dresses. He had been blackballed by Hollywood and she got him back in. And all that culminates with him, her ex-husband, becoming the personal fashion designer for the First Lady, the wife of the man she desperately wanted to marry. I've had some bad luck and love. Like literally, I once got out of the hospital only to find out that the guy I had been dating when I went into the hospital had started dating my roommate while I was in the hospital. And I had only been in the hospital for 3 days. So I get unlucky love. But this, it still beats my story by like a country mile. The next year, Gene is expecting a baby with Howard, but she's once again devastated by a pregnancy when she suffers a miscarriage. Now, we've by now seen this pattern in Gene's life. Up until a few years prior to this, Gene had always been super successful in her career when things were falling apart in her personal life. So she's really motivated to get back into acting, but she hasn't been on the big screen in almost 7 years, and she's now over 40 years old, which at that point in Hollywood was a huge obstacle. She's excited when she lands a part in the star-studded ensemble cast of the film Advise and Consent, but her excitement is short-lived. She had loved acting before her mental health crises, but afterwards, she just felt fear. On the set of the film, she would often feel her throat dry up and heaviness in her chest. The thrill and joy she once got from acting is gone. And in 1964, Gene appears in her final film, The Pleasure Seekers, starring Anne Margaret. It was a very small role, and at 44 years old, Gene realizes it's time to let go of Hollywood. And she's comfortable with this decision. She and Howard Lee decide to live peacefully in a wealthy suburb of Houston, Texas, away from the bright lights of Hollywood and close to his oil fortune. They never had children together, but Gene loved their life. She enjoyed being a housewife, and she had a weekly bridge game. In 1979, she released an autobiography titled Self-Portrait, which is a stellar name for an autobiography. In 1981, sadly, Howard Lee passed away. This man had meant so much to Gene. He had fallen in love with her and stayed in love with her, and more importantly, in my opinion, he had stayed devoted and committed to her at a time when she was at her most vulnerable. Losing him was a huge blow to Gene. Following his death, she spent her last years being more private, but she stayed in Houston. She continued to struggle at times with her memory and her cognizance, but it's hard to be sure if this was a result of mental illness, dementia, or electric shock therapies. Gene developed emphysema, likely due to all the smoking she had done throughout her life. She was a 50-year smoker, something she had, if you remember, started to deepen her voice for the silver screen. And on November 6th, 1991, Gene Tierney passed away from emphysema at the age of 70. Those who had loved her reflected on her warmth, her perseverance, her beauty, and the sheer dichotomy of her life and luck. Her ex-husband, who, by the way, I still don't like him, but he might have said it best when he said, quote, "There was a wonderful girl that was battered by destiny. It appeared that everything had been given to her, and suddenly, at a certain moment in her life, luck ended. She was the unluckiest lucky girl in the world." End quote. While researching, I do always feel like I'm on a roller coaster. There are so many ups and downs in a life of any length, but Gene's life truly threw me for a loop. A part of me mourns the amazing performances that were taken from her and from us by her mental illness. And also, I kind of mourn the fact that honestly, she's not talked about nearly as much as she should be. But the other part of me is really content that Gene gave enough to Hollywood. And in the end, I'm just happy that she found some years of peace. Over the last year of my life, I have learned that the luckiest you can get is to be blessed with contentment. But But the thing that I am most grateful for is that in the end, despite all the obstacles, Gene died the way that I think all mothers want to die, with the knowledge that her children were okay and had both outlived her. That's right, Gene was survived by both of her daughters. Her first daughter, Daria, who had spent most of her life in institutions, lived a very lovely life. She was well cared for, she was loved, and she was often visited by her mother when she was alive and other family members and loved ones. Daria lived to be 66 years old, which is a considerable feat, given all the odds. Gene's other daughter, Christina, went on to make a few appearances in documentaries speaking about her mother's life. She passed away from ovarian cancer in 2015, and like her older sister, she too was 66 at the time of her passing. Very odd coincidence. Let me know in the comments, have you seen any of Gene's movies? If so, which one is your favorite? Obviously mine is the Ghost and Mrs Muir. Also let me know which beauty icon you'd like to see in the next episode of Beauty Biography. Until then, you take care of yourself.